r/NoSleep. Posted by u/LeftyLizard9085. I play a game they call Sleep Points. Every night I hide under my blanket. Part 1. If there's one thing that kids everywhere can probably agree on, it's the fact that bedtimes suck. You want more time in the day to do things you enjoy, or at least enjoy more than lying down with your eyes shut doing literally nothing at all. It's even worse when it's summer and the sun isn't down yet. Even worse when it's summer in Fairbanks, Alaska and the sun basically won't set all summer. But above all, I think it's the fact that you have to do something, anything at all, that primarily annoys us as kids. We don't want to do what we're told, and even if your parents aren't very strict, they probably at some point or other told you when you had to go to bed. Maybe your parents even rewarded you for going to bed without a fight when you were told to. Just to encourage you to not be difficult and give them some peace and quiet. But then there's the fact that you have no idea when you'll go to sleep. For all you know, it's completely possible you'll just stay up the whole night, lying there with nothing at all to distract you but your own thoughts. It isn't likely, sure. But it's still a thing that could theoretically happen. You need sleep to live, so not being sure you'll actually be able to do it can be extremely scary. And it's not like other things you have to do to live, like breathing or eating or drinking, where you can just consciously do it whenever you want. Sleep has to come to you. And not being able to do it is like drowning, except for the fact that drowning kills you in minutes, whereas lack of sleep takes weeks or even months to do the same. My story about the game that I would come to know as Sleep Points began in the winter. Not that winter in central Alaska is much better. There's the obvious fact that it's cold as all hell, but then there's the fact that, unlike in summer, the sun basically never rises. It's pretty much impossible not to have seasonal depression when you only have maybe 3 or 4 hours of sunlight a day, where the sun only just barely creeps above the horizon. I remember it being mid-February of 2019, about a year before the pandemic hit. Monday the 11th to be exact. I remembered it because the day you start playing Sleep Points matters. Not to get too far ahead of myself, but basically, the amount of time you've spent playing determines where you are in the game. But I'll get back to that later, since in the beginning I didn't know anything about how Sleep Points worked. I guess it isn't surprising that Monday, February the 11th started out normally. Days that end up being important always seem to. I got introduced to the game at school when I had to stay after class since I had gotten a detention. I know that probably makes me sound like a bad kid or some kind of troublemaker, but this was honestly the first detention I'd ever gotten. I mostly kept to myself and kept a low profile. My school doesn't really have bullies, but the more popular guys on the sports teams and stuff still gave me crap now and then. I guess there was this one other, less popular, outcast kid that you could probably call a bully, but we'll get to him later on, during detention. Anyway, it wasn't like anyone ever shoved me into lockers or gave me wedgies or whatever other crap you see on TV. Not usually anyway. The harassment was mainly verbal. Like how this one kid, Brian Truman, would always mockingly ask me if I wanted to fight. I guess he thought the idea of me fighting him was funny since he was tall and athletic and I was short and somewhat out of shape. But I could usually just ignore it. But that day was different. That day I managed to have my first ever as seen on TV bullying experience. Though thankfully I haven't had one since. Anyway, after third period, some of Truman's jock buddies talked him into stealing my backpack. My fourth period was really far away from my locker, so I absolutely did not have time for this. I shouted at him to tell him to give it back, but he just kept saying I wouldn't get it back unless I agreed to fight him. For whatever reason, I tried reasoning with him for another minute or two. But eventually, the bell was about to ring and I lost my patience. I socked him in the face. He gut punched me so hard I lost my breath. I tried to fire back, but conveniently a teacher showed up just in time to not help me get my stuff back and to instead give me a detention for fighting. Even though I had to stay after class, I guess it wasn't all bad. Truman was at least true to his word, and I still had my things returned to me, no thanks to the teacher. But I still spent most of fourth period, which I was about 5 minutes late to by the way, upset about the fact that I got in trouble and the fact that my parents were going to get called, all for a situation that I didn't even start. Fortunately, I had been good about being on time to my fourth period US history class since I knew how far away it was from my locker, so I always made a point to get there as fast as possible. Since this was just my first lateness, the teacher, Mr. Springer, let me off with a warning, so I guess I don't have too much of a right to complain about having been late. I spent most of the remaining day just wondering what detention would even be like because again, I had a totally clean record up to this point. Okay, you get it. I'm not saying I was some star student with stellar behavior up to that point who just did no wrong. But I had still never thought of myself as the type of kid who got detention. I had still considered myself the type of kid who at least had somewhat reasonably good behavior, so I just never thought something would happen to make me end up there. Anyway, when the end of the school day finally came and I got to the detention room, it was pretty much empty except for the teacher overseeing detention named Mrs. Bagfield from my 5th period Algebra 2 class and this other tall and scrawny kid who was a junior, making him about 2 years older than me since I was a freshman at the time. He pretty much made it his mission in life to get as many detentions and in as much trouble as humanly possible. He was the only one there besides Mrs. Bagfield and I, since Truman got assigned to a different room for detention on account of how the reason we were both in detention in the first place was for fighting one another. His name was Ezra Livingston. They called him Ezra the Edgelord. And by they I really just mean Ezra himself. No one else seriously called him that outside of making fun of him for the lame-ass nickname he came up with for himself. I had never talked to him very much, but Ezra was the type of kid where, even if you hadn't met him, you knew about him on account of all the negative attention he was always trying to attract toward himself. He was pretty much as stereotypically contrarian as they come. Just like his nickname says, he was just insanely edgy. I talked about how my school didn't have any real bullies, but I think Ezra comes closer to being one than just about anybody else there. This was, of course, the one kid I was talking about before whom you could probably call a serious bully. He wasn't the type of kid you'd usually think of as a bully, though, since he wasn't on any sports teams. And, like I said before, he wasn't popular, and was instead pretty awkwardly tall and lanky, so it's not like he even looked all that buff or intimidating or anything. I know I'm a bit on the shorter and chubbier side since I'm 5'5" and weigh something like 170 or 180 pounds, but this kid was easily a good 9 or 10 inches taller than me and must have still weighed about 40 or 50 pounds less than I do. Anyway, he just did whatever he could to piss anybody around him off. It never mattered who it was or what he had to do to make it happen. He'd act like that even around guys way bigger than himself, too. And yeah, they'd kick his ass, but he never cared about that. Any beating was worth getting a rise out of somebody as far as he was concerned. I was kinda glad to have detention with Ezra though, just because Mrs. Bagfield spent way more time with her eyes on him than on me. Even when Ezra wasn't in detention, faculty and staff kept their eye on him. He'd always joke about shooting up the school or bringing a bomb or something like that. And I guess just because he's the type of loner edgy kid who might seriously do something like that one of these days, the teachers always took it seriously. Since I was bored, I started looking around at the desk I was sitting at, looking at the swastika and pentagram and anarchist and communist symbols and all kinds of other offensive shit drawn on it. No doubt all of them were drawn by Ezra from when he must have sat at that desk during one of his countless detentions. These symbols might seem a bit incoherent all being placed next to one another, but, as Ezra himself would always say, his politics were go to hell and go fuck yourself. And he pretty much lived his life by that motto. Like I said, pretty much as textbook contrarian as they come. Like yeah, he drew a swastika, but I had pretty serious doubts he was an actual Nazi. He always seemed to have too much of a problem with authority to actually go along with an ideology like that during the time of the Third Reich. He probably just knew the swastika was just another symbol that offended people, so he threw it in there for good measure. Now, I'm sure he was totally aware of its association with the Nazis and what they stood for. Pretty much any history class will teach you about that. I just doubt he cared since he never cared about much of anything. But of course, other people had sat at that desk before too, and there was this heart drawn with the initials BT plus AB in it, since Brian Truman and Anastasia Bowman were a couple. I've already told you about Truman, being that he was the asshole who took my backpack and landed my ass in detention in the first place. But I don't think I've brought up Anastasia just yet. Anastasia was actually born in Russia, but since the last name she was given at birth was spelled Bauman and her family didn't want English speakers calling them something like Bauman by mistake, they had the spelling changed to Bowman since their name is pronounced like the words bow and man. Of course, it didn't really do them as much good as they had probably hoped, because their name is pronounced Bowman like taking a bow, but people would still pronounce it Bowman like bow and arrow by mistake anyway. But I guess because they had already committed to the name change, they just decided to roll with the new spelling regardless. She was in my 6th period environmental science class. On the first day of school, the teacher, Mr. Brigham, had us do all the usual lame-ass icebreaker bullshit the teacher usually has you do. When it was Anastasia's turn to talk, she had told us all about what I just talked about, how she was born in Russia and her family came to America, but that she was too young to remember when it happened, so she couldn't really tell us a whole lot about what living in Russia was like. I don't think any of us would have known about that without her telling us. She always spoke in a very sophisticated sort of way and always with a perfect American accent. I guess since she had lived in the US for as long as she could remember, that must have helped her adopt the accent. But even by like halfway through the school year when all the sleep points shit started happening, I hadn't really learned a whole lot else about her. What I mainly wound up taking interest in during detention, though, was this post-it note in the back of the desk. I started picking at it just to have something to do with my hands, but I got curious and took a look at it. I almost dismissed it out of hand. Oh, what could have been? It was just a bunch of random letters, numbers, and punctuation marks. Maybe whoever wrote all those characters just wrote them down randomly because they were bored. But in any case, since I was bored too, I played a game with myself where I'd try to type all the characters as one big word into Google and see what results came up without getting caught. I mostly thought that nothing would show up, but I figured that sequence of characters still had to mean something. Like maybe it was part of a link to a video or article or something and Google would direct me to whatever that was. Even though the sequence of characters was pretty long, it wasn't actually all that difficult to win at my little game. Ezra was of course being his usual provocative self, being as disruptive as possible and cursing at the teacher whenever she complained. Like when she complained about how he brought in a bag of Cheetos to detention and seemed to be making a point to crunch them as loudly as possible. Food wasn't allowed in detention and Mrs. Bagfield had a major pet peeve about people chewing or crunching loudly. So when she took them away from him, he called her a bitch and talked about how touching his food with her cum-coated hands spoiled his appetite anyway. This of course would not be the end of Ezra's antics. Pretty much as soon as the teacher took his Cheetos away, without missing a beat he pulled out a pack of gum, put it all in his mouth all at once, and then started chewing that as obnoxiously as possible instead. Since you can't really swallow gum, or at least you're not supposed to, he tried to make the case that technically gum wasn't a food, making it fair game for detention. But Mrs. Bagfield wasn't buying it. She said it was a distraction and then Ezra asked what she was gonna do about it and if she could take the gum out of his mouth any better than she can take the dick out of hers. That comeback fell a bit flat, since with all the gum in his mouth, his words were kinda muffled at that point. But, to my surprise, she actually put on some plastic gloves and then forced his jaw down and literally took the wad of gum straight out of his mouth just like he said. "Don't give me any more ideas," she said after she threw it in the trash can. With all of that going on, I was able to type in all the characters from the post-it note without detection. And when I did, something surprising happened. One result actually did come up. It was the exact string of characters, none removed, no extra ones added in, nothing. I clicked on the result and it took me to the App Store. It had an icon of a guy in bed snoring, so I figured it must be some app about sleep. Maybe it would play relaxing sounds or have someone doing ASMR or something like that to help you fall asleep. I didn't really know what the app was all about, but since I was bored to death and trying to kill time until detention was over, I downloaded it just to check it out. But it didn't even look like you could do anything with the app. I opened it up and all I saw was a blank white screen with the number 0 at the center. That number was of course meant to tell me how many sleep points I had, but at the time I had no idea what it was supposed to mean. To me, it was just a meaningless number. I tried to delete the app since it was obviously useless and just gonna take up space on my phone. But for whatever reason, I couldn't actually seem to delete it. That seemed weird, but at first I didn't think much of it. Finally detention ended and since my dad had already gotten a call about how I had gotten a detention, he knew to come pick me up and said I was grounded for a week from electronics. I tried to explain the situation to him, and how someone else had started it and the fact that I really needed what was in my backpack for class, but before I could get anywhere with that, he just cut me off and started lecturing me about how I should have gone to a teacher. Obviously telling on somebody never really makes you popular, especially when you're in high school. And even then, the teachers give so little of a fuck about the students that I doubt they would have even helped me anyway. So we got home and I got treated to pretty much the same lecture from my mom. Then my dad asked me for my phone. I took one last look at it knowing it'd be the last one I'd get for the week. And when I did, I noticed that my phone was only at 10%. That seemed really weird since I never let its battery get below like 20% and it was at about 60% at the start of detention. So I had no idea how it managed to lose half of its battery life within the hour or so between then and now. Since I noticed it was almost dead, I asked him if he could keep it on a charger in his and mom's room, and he agreed. But my phone's battery wasn't the only weird thing I noticed when I got home. Once I entered my room ready to spend the rest of the day doing homework and complaining to myself in my head about what had happened that day, I noticed a little analog clock sitting on my bedstand that I'd never seen in my life. It had a white casing surrounding the face with a flat bottom that let it stand up on its own. It also had a pane of glass in front of its face so that you couldn't touch its hands, but you could still see the time. I didn't know if my parents had randomly bought me a clock as some sort of gift or how it had gotten into my room. But I liked having little mysteries like these to speculate about just to keep my mind occupied and distracted from everything else that was going on. Like, for example, maybe I just misread the battery percentage at the start of detention and it was just a lot lower than what I thought it was. Maybe my dad had gotten me a clock just so that I could count down the seconds to when I'd be ungrounded, or at least to have something to look at while I had no way to pass the time. At around 5, according to my new clock, my dad came into my room to tell me to start doing my homework. I figured he'd talk about how he had given me a clock as a gift, or at least start grilling me on where I'd gotten it from. But he didn't say a word about it. He didn't even notice it was there for all I could tell. That presented me with another mystery. Was I the only one who could see this clock? Did my dad just think I had always had it? Had I really had it all along and I just didn't bother paying attention to it until that day, when I had nothing better to do outside of watching it? Right when I had gotten done with homework, my mom called me to the kitchen for dinner. She and Dad talked all about how they were disappointed in my recent behavior and that I needed to get my act together because what had happened was now on my permanent record and colleges were gonna look at that, and how I better stay out of trouble or else someday I might get expelled. But I think the fact that Ezra still went to my school pretty much disproved that. Even though Fairbanks is one of the biggest cities for like hundreds of miles, it's still fairly small just because no one lives in Alaska. So there's still only so many schools a kid can go to if you were to ever get expelled. And even then, the school him and I went to called College High School, was probably the only one that would take him anyway, since pretty much all the other schools in and around Fairbanks had better funding and higher standards for what kind of student was allowed to go there. I know college is a pretty weird name for a high school since it is, after all, a high school and not actually a college. But there's a little town called College within broader Fairbanks because of the college nearby, and since my high school was nearby also, it got the seemingly contradictory name that it did. But anyway, like I was saying, if you ever did manage to get expelled from our school, it wasn't like there was anything else they could do with you, so no one ever really was. Once I had eaten dinner, I went back to my room. I noticed that according to my new clock, it was 8 in the evening. I didn't even know that much time had passed since last I checked, so I was a little surprised. I also noticed that the clock's face was a bit reddish or pinkish when I had remembered it being white when I first looked at it. Maybe I had forgotten its color. Or maybe I was just seriously losing my marbles from what a day I had had. I didn't know for sure at the time if this was all connected to the app with the long string of characters for a title with the icon of a guy snoring in his bed that I had just downloaded, but by now, the idea was creeping its way into the back of my mind, so I was somewhat beginning to suspect it. Not that I could check my phone to be sure. But still, the app had to do something. And it just looked sketchy as hell. Since there was no point in staying up since there was nothing to do, I just tried to go to sleep. Though since it was so early, I didn't find it very easy to do that. I tried boring myself to sleep by watching the clock. It had some interesting qualities. For example, I noticed that the clock's color definitely was changing over time. By 9:30, I knew for sure that the face of the clock had to have gotten redder than what it was when I first looked at it at 8 o'clock. And I was able to tell since I also noticed that the redder the clock's face got, the more it would glow in the dark. At first, I honestly thought it looked pretty cool. I had never seen a clock do that before, so whoever had mysteriously given me a clock at least had the decency to give me a glow-in-the-dark one, which I thought was nice. But with my room being pitch black and my only source of light being a clock whose face kept getting a deeper and deeper shade of red, and one that was slowly getting brighter and brighter at that, it legitimately started to get a bit spooky, I'm not gonna lie. Another hour and a half later, it was 11 o'clock and if I wasn't spooked before I definitely was by then. At around that time I had to seriously start questioning my own sanity. Because I thought for sure that I was beginning to see a human's face in what was supposed to be a clock's face behind the glass and the clock's hands. Or at least vaguely human. I had read about how if you look in the mirror long enough in the dark, you start hallucinating faces that aren't there. That must have been what was going on. Maybe the glass in front of the clock's face was just reflective and acting like a mirror, and I was just looking at my own face. But that still didn't explain why the clock was changing color. Or why it had gone from being just a normal clock to one that glowed in the dark. All without me pressing any buttons or really doing anything with it at all, come to think about it. There also wasn't any reason I could find for why the face and the clock seemed to be getting more and more clear. Where before, I thought I might have just been seeing myself, the face got to the point where it was so clear that there was no way that could have been me. By 11:45 I had been convinced this couldn't be a hallucination. I know the whole point of hallucinations are supposed to be that they look real, but I'm sorry. This just looked too real to be in my head. By that time the clock had also gone a deep shade of total blood red. And the face almost seemed to be trying to escape from the clock. Like it was going to do something to me when it did. And let me tell you, this was not at all a pretty face. I'd say it looked like death, but I get the feeling even death would be more attractive. It wasn't smiling, but it did seem to have an abnormally large mouth. In fact, it wasn't even just the mouth. All the facial features, the eyes, nose, and mouth all seemed unnaturally large. They looked like they were growing, and when the clock could no longer contain them, whatever was inside was gonna suddenly burst out. But it was mainly the eyes that scared me. Most people have eyes that are wide and have black pupils, but for this face it looked like the exact opposite, with black irises and white pupils. The pupils also looked slender. Sort of vertical, like what a cat's might be. But it was more than just how different these eyes looked from regular eyes. Honestly, that was the least of my worries. It was the expression they had. I got the feeling that with each passing minute those eyes were just getting even more hate-filled and predatory than the last. By 11:57, I had totally lost my shit. The color, the brightness, the clarity of the face, the size of the face, the look of hatred, all of it was coming to a head. I know this all probably sounds pretty stupid, but I was honestly more terrified than I could ever remember being up to that point. I just tucked my head under the covers and laid down totally flat, without moving a muscle. This all must have been leading up to something that would happen at midnight. I didn't know what that would be, and I was fighting for my fucking life not to find out. For what must have been the next 3 minutes, I thought I was dead. Literally dead. Whatever fucking demon was in that clock was just about to drag me straight down to hell. So this is how I die, I told myself in my head, since I was still too mortified to make a sound. Not that it had felt like 3 minutes. But that made sense, because, what with my whole ass life flashing before my eyes, I'll bet time probably would have had a way of seemingly slowing down. I heard it. I had heard a sound that sounded like glass shattering. The clock was broken. Whatever was in the clock had obviously come out by now. I heard it as it slithered and snaked its way around my room. Just don't move, just don't fucking move. Whatever it is, it won't know you're there, I told myself. I wouldn't find out for another week or so just how right I was. Or at least, that I had been kind of right. It's complicated. But at the time, the clock demon, or whatever the fuck kind of supernatural shit it was that was fucking with me, seemed to just randomly disappear. It must have been at least a good 15 minutes before I finally got the courage to stick my head out from under the covers and see what was going on. Nothing was there. Not even a light from the clock. But that made sense to me from how it had obviously been broken by that point. I didn't know why the thing in my clock left. But I was in no mood to question it. Just glad it was gone. I must have spent the rest of the time I was still awake that night, just praying to God that that never would happen again. Despite the fact that I was an atheist.